Kabanenko and Glen will be talking for 15 minutes each, after which we're going to take your questions. And I strongly urge people to ask questions, given the importance of this topic, because that's the way everybody in town learns about Ukraine, by asking. So let me reiterate the fact that the two previous speakers, Ambassador Yelchenko and Congressman Harris, pointed out this is a multi-dimensional war. It's not a conflict, it's a war. And in fact, it's part of Russia's larger war against the West, which has been going on for 15 years, in no small measure because of Ukraine, because of the loss Moscow suffered in 2004 and 5 when it tried to covertly install Yanukovych and failed, and blamed the West for its failure. And has since then completely turned and was preparing what became the operation to launch the Black Sea as early as 2005 and 6. There's plenty of evidence to suggest this. So since then, what we see is a multidimensional war, as I said. Kinetic force, energy, information warfare, diplomacy, all the usual instruments of power. We also have to understand, and Ambassador Yelchenko alluded to this, there was a debate yesterday at the Atlantic Council. Why should we care about Ukraine? 25 years ago, a former Pentagon official by the name of Sherman Garnett wrote a book called Ukraine, the Keystone in the Arch. Keystone in the Arch of European Security. That has not changed. And if Ukraine were to be suborned, then every neighboring state of Ukraine would come under intensified pressure beyond what we are already seeing, whether it be from Finland in the north to Turkey in the south. And the pressure not only to establish a pro-Russian European system in terms of diplomacy, but in terms of internal governance, and we see what Russia's internal governance leads to, would become very, very strong and would undo the settlement of 1989 to 91. That is what we're fighting for. We are not just interested in Ukraine's security, but Ukraine is a part of European security, and it is the front, or the main front, if you like, in what has become a multi-dimensional war from Finland all the way south to the Black Sea. And it would not take much for Russia to expand the war if its leadership was reckless enough, as we see what's happening in Turkey, where yesterday it was revealed that Russian and Turkish forces were actually shooting at each other. Were that to expand, then the Black Sea would be part of a much larger and much more dangerous conflagration. Under the circumstances, how can we not only help Ukraine, but also our own interests and that of our allies in Europe? Because that's what the real issue is. We're not talking just about some government 2,000 miles away, paraphrase Neville Chamberlain. We're talking about a key in the European state system that cannot be allowed to fail for both reasons of our interests and our values. I recently published an article the other day on the Atlantic Council website that talked about how we could do things in a military point of view to help Ukraine and Europe through NATO, beyond what we're already doing. And that would also serve the purposes of helping to bring Ukraine closer, both in physical and material terms, to Europe and European integration, as well as in terms of intangibles, that is politics, to European integration, which is increasingly what the Ukrainian population appears to want. In the military sphere, apart from what has already been done and what has already been contracted for and what Congress will authorize and legislate in FY 2020, there are things that can be done right now by executive action which would materially influence the situation and communicate to Russia our resolve and make it clear that the continuing diplomacy of Putin and Lavrov and formerly officials like Surkov, that Ukraine doesn't exist, or shouldn't exist, and can only be ruled by force, will be stopped. Secretary of Defense Esper the other week said that the Navy is going to have to give up several ships. They can't afford to maintain them, We are rebuilding our Navy for reasons of strategic considerations, mainly dealing with China. I would suggest that we take a leaf from the past, that is from 1940-41, and revive Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease, started by Roosevelt, lent the British government 50 destroyers in return for leases on Caribbean bases. The British got the ability to command the sea. We got the ability to prevent the spread of Nazism into South and Central America, which was a major concern to the Roosevelt administration back then. We can do the same now. These ships that Secretary Esper has talked about mothballing, or dismantling, to the extent that they are usable in the conditions of the Baltic, Black, and Mediterranean seas, should be lent to Ukraine and our NATO allies so that they can be used there as part of the conventional deterrent against Russia and to stop the threat of Russian encroachment on Ukraine in the Black Sea and potentially in the Sea of Azov if those ships are suitable. And that's beyond what we've already done to help the Ukrainian Navy. The money that is saved by European governments, who then don't have to build these ships because they're already under pressure to raise defense spending and make it more efficient, that money could then be used to build the infrastructure from the north of Eastern Europe to the south, which is the most backward dimension of it, in order to strengthen the logistics support for the NATO fronts in the Baltic and Black Sea and for Ukraine, and to integrate the area under the Three Seas Initiative. We have announced we're giving Ukraine, the Three Seas Initiative, $1 billion to build that infrastructure. There are things we can do as well in energy, but I'm not going to have time. But the point is we can help Eastern Europe and Ukraine help themselves to build that infrastructure and to strengthen their military capability to deal with the Russian threat at the same time as we progress on other areas like energy and information, which will be discussed today. These are vital interests of the United States, of Ukraine, and of our European allies. And I have raised this issue here, not just for your consideration, but hopefully for consideration on the Hill and in the government, because we need to do more. One last point, information warfare. Moscow has now shown itself committing war crimes in Syria as well as in Ukraine. The Dutch government has a very strong, probably overwhelming case about the shooting down of MH17 6 years ago. That case may well come before the International Court of Justice soon, and it may well be found that Russia and Putin are found to be war criminals. This has ramifications beyond Ukraine, but I would suggest that one of the things we need to do as supporters of Ukraine is start beating the drum for a lawfare campaign to incriminate Russia for the acts it has committed both in Ukraine and in Syria, and that reveal the true nature of the Russian state. Thank you. I will now turn to Admiral Kabanenko.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thanks a lot for invitation to take part in this important event. This is my second attendance in this forum, and I would remind you that after first my participation, it was made a decision for transfer of 2 island-class Papal boats to Ukraine, and these boats really was the first step of creation of mosquito fleet in our country. This is urgently needed to adequately response of Russian threats. Let's speak about maritime security, directly about important from my perspective aspects. Next slide, please.
Oh, you have the clicker.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, you can see here in this slide, you can see the current situation in this area and this Russian belt of worst threats in the northwestern Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Here, this belt looks like a connection between zone of Russian maritime domination in the Sea of Azov. After Kerch Strait, Russia provide the blockade of our the Sea of Azov ports, Mariupol and Berdyansk. And of course, it has influence.
If we're talking to the mic.
Yeah, okay. And it has influence on.
I think you can take
not only in maritime security in this area, but also in the
Closer to the mic.
situation.
I think that one's important.
So, of course, Russia created unsinkable aircraft carrier in Crimea with a huge amount of forces not needed for defense. All of them are offensive. Area denial capabilities, Russian Black Sea Fleet capabilities, were deployed in the area of occupied gas rigs in the vicinity of Odessa, and one rig Tavrida. Right now it's distance from Odessa to this gas rig is around 100 kilometers, but more than 150 kilometers from Crimea. It means that it's in vicinity, really in vicinity of mainland of Ukraine. And of course, these security threats belt Russia created not just for nothing. Of course, Russia has a strong goal to block NATO activities in this region, and of course to provide naval forces projection to the Eastern Mediterranean. Of course, Russia considers the traditional Russian operational art. Russia consider the Ukraine as a Ukrainian forces, Ukraine as open flanks of Russia and this security threats belt. And of course, this is why recently Putin again said about so-called Prichernomorye. Before that it was Novorossia, but now it looks like Prichernomorye, so it's intention of Russia to occupy these coast regions of Ukraine. And of course, you can see here what Russian aggressive plans, of course, just continues to Eastern Mediterranean, and this is geopolitical ambitions which presents main provisions you can find in main provisions of naval strategy of Russia up to 2025. So it looks very dangerous. And next slide, you can find what Ukraine unfortunately doesn't control most part of its sovereign sea waters, of its exclusive economic zone after annexation of Crimea. This water is even bigger than territories of Ukraine's free coast connection Black Sea regions, Odessa, Mykolaiv, and Kherson. You can see this on the slide, and of course it's worried situation. A couple words about Mariupol and Berdyansk, because both still continue to struggle to stay afloat amid Russian hybrid war. For example, turnover of Mariupol support decreased more than half, and now you can see on the slide what it still continue to survive because first of all Kerch Bridge it's limited, it's severely limited the passage via Kerch Strait, and of course activities of Russian FSB which continue boarding operation in this area without any of course it's violation of international law, United Nations Convention of Law of the Sea, and other international documents, international rules in terms of providing maritime security. Important slide, it still continue Russian creeping annexation of the sea. The Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. You can see what in 2014 it was in the vicinity of Crimea and the vicinity of Crimea. And in 2016, 17, 18, it was spread, and this creeping annexation was continuous. And now it's a domination, Russian domination in the Sea of Azov. And of course in the vicinity of Odessa, and new phenomena you can see on the slide, Russia finding new areas in the north of Crimea. These areas are very important because it looks like the region fjord. This allows forces to operate there without threats to be destroyed from other side. So these also new areas in open part of the sea, Russia began to operate there exactly during the military naval exercise, common naval exercise in Georgia, where our ship took part, and Russia intended in this time to provide some actions against this ship, and only from my perspective, only presence of the U.S. destroyer doesn't allow Russia to implement this plan. So it still continue creeping annexation of these areas. Russia tried to demonstrate what that Moscow possess this sea, continuous strategy to transform these sea areas to Russian lake. And of course it needs to adequate response. Adequate response not only keeping in mind of Ukraine maritime security, but also NATO and EU. Couple of words about Ukrainian response. Unfortunately, up to now, clear maritime strategy of Ukraine doesn't exist. It's a huge question, and from my perspective, we need support of our strategic partner of the United States, maritime nation, because first experience of creation of naval strategy of Ukraine up to 2035 was successful. This strategy was created at the end of 2018. It was different discussions, very professional discussions among participants who was involved in creation of this strategy. And from my perspective, very good cost-effective approach was found. This approach means creation of naval mosquito capabilities of our naval forces, and this way still continues. Some contradiction exists because some political persons still continue to think to what we should create a bigger ships fleet, but from my perspective it doesn't have financial, technological and other capabilities to do that. And of course we need to solve problems right now. Still exists some kind of continental mentality, land-centric approach, particularly among politicians in different structures. It means what they think, what Ukraine can solve any problems at sea based on coastal capabilities. From my professional way, it's estimation, it's the wrong way, because in history, for example, we don't have evidences of successful anti-amphibious operation only based on land capabilities. Successful operations took place based on both inter-services capabilities, maritime, naval, means air, and of course land capabilities. So right now, we urgently needed those capabilities, and in this regard, we're looking for help of the United States based on FMS and FMF program, and of course support of our naval forces, training of personnel, support of transformation based on NATO standards is vital as well. So you can see in this slide what our naval strategy means. What right now mosquito capabilities is a priority. Conclusions of my short presentation. Maritime security threats to Ukraine have a tendency to increase and should be considered as Ukraine's first priorities, defense and security priority. Second, current Ukraine's political establishment pays attention to maritime security issues. However, a continental mentality dominates among political decision makers. Long-term maritime strategy of Ukraine remain unclear. Third, naval strategy of Ukraine up to 2035 has been approved in the end of 2018, but its implementation hasn't begun yet. This is also a problem because implementation plan means creation mosquito capabilities, but this process is slow. Looks slow. According to the naval strategy of Ukraine, mosquito naval capabilities are urgently needed to adequately respond to existing and future threats on maritime domain. And fifth, last but for sure not the least, the support of mosquito naval capabilities creation of naval capabilities of Ukrainian naval forces creation is vital for Ukrainian survival and for Ukraine to not only demonstrate ability but deter Russian ambitions in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, and to avoid Crimean annexation of sea waters of Ukraine, exclusive maritime zone, and so on. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back here again, and I appreciate the fact that Walter's invited me back again. I always like to begin my talk with the kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly about Ukraine. I think that there's a lot of issues at hand these days that are good. I think that Ukraine's always seems to take one step forward and two steps back. I think that many of you know that we have at this discussion one of the key things that I've always talked about has been the need for a Ukrainian Navy, and that you cannot retake Crimea without a Navy, and so this is something that Ukraine, because the trident is a part of the national symbol, there is a certain maritime dimension to Ukraine that is important. Now, we had, I think in the case that when I started talking several years ago about Ukraine and the need for a Navy, the good news is that now I think slowly but surely senior policymakers in Ukraine are starting to understand that they do need a Navy. To the point that it is becoming something that in their understanding. But the bad news part of it is Ukraine's lost the Sea of Azov. Mariupol is economically dying. Russia controls the Kerch Straits, and Admiral Fogo said we're not going into the Sea of Azov. So there's no plans for the U.S. Navy to go into the Sea of Azov. And as General Hodges wrote in his recent report for SIPA, on the Black Sea, the U.S. Navy is not even utilizing the number of days available through the Montreux Convention to even be in the Black Sea. So this is an element of concern on our part from the United States about the overall balance of power in the Black Sea. Now, yesterday, as Ukraine always does, it takes one step forward and two steps backward. Ukraine finally had, as a Minister of Defense, an English-speaking Minister of Defense, Andrei Zagorodnik, who was stepped down yesterday. And sadly, the minister certainly had been the most responsive of any Ukrainian Minister of Defense to Ukraine's need for naval forces. And this was a major development, a very big improvement that I never really thought would happen inside of Ukraine. But unfortunately, I think he fell victim to what I fear may be the Kolomoiskification of Ukrainian defense circles. I hope I'm wrong, and I may be wrong, But I think that Ukraine has to have a vision, and it has to have, but as Dr. Brzezinski once said, a vision is not a blueprint for a strategy. And I think that this is a very important part of how Ukraine moves forward. On this stage today with me is one of Admiral Kabanenko, who's been one of the great intellectual drivers of Ukrainian naval strategy and the Ukrainian Navy policy, which the fundamental basis of which is based upon the Mosquito Fleet strategy. And that Mosquito Fleet strategy is very critical. Now, I'm sure everyone in the room has their favorite John Wayne movie, and I'm sure everyone can quote 5 movies that John Wayne made that you may remember and appeal to you. One of my favorite is the movie In Harm's Way. And if you recall the movie, the whole essence of the film is about the U.S. being in the Pacific and having not the adequate defense forces and naval forces to be able to take on the Japanese. Therefore, PT-109 and the PT boats and the light and heavy cruisers were basically, after Pearl Harbor, were the mainstay of the U.S. Navy's fighting strength in the Pacific. But the key thing about the movie, In Harm's Way, is the issue of buying time. The ability of the United States to get its industrial strength together, the ability to rebuild the Navy after the losses at Pearl Harbor were critical. Now, I am not a proponent of going around town saying Ukraine needs to be in NATO. Okay, I am not of that school, because you cannot get into NATO with Soviets thinking and non-English speaking generals in the Ukrainian army. You need English, you need American trained officers. It's very critical and very important. I profoundly believe that you have to have a strategy. We had a meeting yesterday with a retired U.S. Admiral who had several salient points about Ukraine's defense strategy. And I think the key thing, and this is where the Mosquito boats are very critical in the Mosquito strategy, which basically is small, fast attack boats. And the basis of the strategy is that they want to, the fast attack boats, which are similar to the PT-109 that I alluded to earlier, create strategic ambiguity for Russia. Ukraine needs to disrupt the Russian timeline. Now, if you look at a map, you realize that Russia controls the Kerch Straits. Well, what does Ukraine have left in terms of a maritime seaboard? You have Odessa. Now, you have Odessa, and 1/4, 25% of the Ukrainian economy is based upon the exports of Odessa. But what happens when an Odessa is reduced and cannot export anything, such as the case with Mariupol today, which basically relies on Ukraine asking Russia for permission to use the Kerch Strait. So we're left with basically Odessa. We're now left with the issue of how does Ukraine preserve and defend Odessa, and that brings in the question of the Mosquito Fleet and the strategy, because Ukraine needs to disrupt the Russian timeline. I'm sorry, but I don't think the United States or NATO are going to come save Ukraine anytime soon. Now, why did the Admiral yesterday talk about disrupting the Russian timeline? Because whatever Ukraine does in defending itself, it needs time for NATO and the United States to mobilize itself to be able to possibly provide relief. Now, part of the good news is the idea that the U.S. Airborne and the U.S. Army, as a part of the Defender 2020 exercises, is now introducing the concept of forcible entry operations, which is will bring later this year the descent of the U.S. 82nd Airborne into operations in Georgia. Now, this is important because forcible entry operations can have implications for Ukraine. In other words, we would hope someday that the 82nd Airborne might be dropped into areas near Odessa as a sign of American resolve to protect Ukraine and to prevent the Russians from going even further. Now, this is a very critical component because we're starting to develop the ideas about how we defend Ukraine in the Black Sea. But again, this is a case where the United States and NATO are not going to be there to help Ukraine, and it's going to be basically Ukraine relying on itself and its defense capabilities to buy time to gain time for the NATO and the United States to do something. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's Ukraine's responsibility to defend itself. And I'm not of that view that everybody should be talking about more sanctions and more of this, and we need to get more serious and go Team Ukraine, and we want to be there with you. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's all about Ukraine and its ability to defend itself. Now, I think that as part of that solution, that Ukraine is finally starting to understand the idea of deterrence. I would say that I know that my time is limited, but what we're seeing today in the modern battlefield of Idlib in Syria is really about the future of really deterrence as a model. Now, why would I be saying that? Well, many of you know that my wife is Turkish, so obviously I have an interest in Turkey, and every night I'm shown the picture of all the new attack drones that Turkey's producing, because, by the way, Turkey has now become a drone superpower, and the largest exporter of drones, military drones in the world, is to which country? Ukraine. Ukraine, the good news, has attack drones now. They're called the Bayraktar attack drone, and Russia, unfortunately, doesn't have attack drones. It has reconnaissance drones. And so if you're reading the Russian press these days, you're seeing news saying, Russia, we're getting whacked in Idlib by Turkish drones, and we have no attack drones of ourselves. Not only is Turkey exporting the attack drones of Bayraktar to Ukraine, and they're now painted with nice pictures of the Ukrainian emblem on the planes, but Turkey is also now going to start producing the attack drones inside of Ukraine. So why do I talk about Idlib and the situation there? Because there's a certain model of deterrence that is appearing, that is getting away from, you heard the congressman speak today about sanctions and all this, we need to do more of that. The model of deterrence, as Steve Blank and others will tell you, the model of deterrence is very Bismarckian. And the idea of that you cannot resolve and achieve anything diplomatically without the use of force is a very important part of that model. In other words, being able to defend yourself. Now Erdogan is in Moscow today. He's trying to talk to Putin, but and over 50 Turkish soldiers have died inside of Idlib by the hands of the Russians. But there's a certain model of deterrence where Turkey is trying to present itself to fight Russia, to preserve its national interests in a forward way in Idlib, in a way that this deterrence model, as they're continuing to negotiate with Russia, but at the same time they're prepared to defend their national interest and make a point. And this is coming at a time when NATO's not helping Turkey. The U.S. can't export or won't, for some reasons, export the Patriots to defend Turkey. And I think this situation is very similar to Ukraine, because Ukraine, in many ways, despite all the rhetoric of the United States, and it's great the United States is willing to export the javelins to Ukraine. That's a great step forward for Ukraine. But the point is that you have to have generals and military people who understand how to use this equipment and defend the country. And the model of deterrence is is increasingly kind of going back to this, because you're seeing the European Union, in the case of Idlib, is unable to do anything. There's no help for the refugees. There's no help for Turkey. NATO's not there. So ultimately, the model of deterrence is going to be a nation states defending their interests and hoping that sooner or later the 7th Cavalry will arrive at some point to help the country, and that's in the case of Ukraine. That's certainly going to be the case. But this is a very critical point now, because Ukraine has to start understanding what the models of deterrence are. I'm not a champion of that the sanctions are going to solve anything, because ultimately, at the end of the day, the use of force and your ability to defend yourself in Donbass and stop it from being what Walter referred to today, very brilliantly captured, is we've had cases of frozen conflicts, okay? Now we have in Donbass a bleeding conflict, and Ukrainians cannot continue to die every day on the front lines for the hope that someday that the United States and somebody will convince Putin that he will get up and leave Donbass and have a peaceful resolution of the conflict. The only thing at the end of the day will be the use of force and the ability of Ukraine to defend itself. And I hate to quote Alexander III, but he did have a very common Russian phrase that says Russia only has two friends, the army and the navy. And I think that this is very important, because this issue about how Ukraine develops itself and its national security interests, it's going to largely, it's going to have to do this on its own, but it has the tools available to do it. And by that, I mean the issue of the mosquito fleet strategy, the ability to purchase American military equipment and to develop a strategy to defend itself are very critical. I'll end my comments there, but I think that, you know, overall we've made some progress in Ukraine in the idea of the understanding that they need a Navy. You cannot retake Crimea ever unless you have a Navy. The U.S. Navy, I don't think, is going to be there for you to help you retake Crimea. And so eventually, at the end of the day, it's going to be about Ukraine and its allies and how it develops its defense strategies and what type of defense strategy it wants to have in pursuing its national interests, which are very critical and very important. So, thank you.
We have 27 minutes until the coffee break. So if you have questions, this is your opportunity. Please raise your hand. I'll call upon you, and we'll get you the mic. Nadja, just can you bring her the mic? Please identify yourself also when you ask.
Nadia McConnell, U.S. Ukraine Foundation. There's a difference between coming to the rescue, and I, for one, do not believe that NATO or the U.S. is going to be the cavalry that arrives. But it's another thing to not give what Ukraine needs to defend itself. So do you see a realization in the U.S. or in NATO that Ukraine should get these mosquito fleets? In other words, are they helping Ukraine help itself?
Ukraine, the U.S. only responds to Ukraine when in a reactive way. So, for example, until the Kerch Straits incident in November 2018, when the Gürze-class gunboats were trying to make their way, forcible entry, or freedom of navigation, if you want to call it, into the Kerch Straits, the Russians responded in a military way. 24 Ukrainian sailors were captured. They were sent to Moscow and held in prison there for over a year and a half. Now, it's a great thing that those guys are home, but it was a gamble by Poroshenko by sending the Navy to conduct a mission. But what happened with that was it was a wake-up call within NATO and the United States in regards to the need to help Ukraine with a Navy. And that set in motion a variety of things where the United States at least started talking about it, and Ukraine had a plan and said, we want this assistance for our Navy, and it did wake people up. Now, the United States is, again, to answer your question, is a highly reactive mode. And I wouldn't even think that the U.S. Is now sending, reportedly in the press, planes of ammunition to resupply the Turkish army because they're running out of ammunition. That wouldn't be happening unless the Turkish army was fighting with the Russians in Idlib. My point here is that a lot of the fate of Ukraine and of these countries is in your own hands. And how you stand up and fight and get the attention of the West and deserves your support is something that Ukraine, I think, has to figure out. I think at some point, with the Zelensky government and its idea of negotiations with Russia, you know, it's achieved some things, but still Donbass is still occupied, and there's no plans really in motion. And I do hope that Zelensky does not go to the May Day celebrations in Moscow. And I'll bring up one point here I forgot to mention. On December 19th, Putin made a speech, and he mentioned the word Prichornomorye. And this is a term for the Black Sea coastline. Now, I would say we are in a very dangerous situation because on May 9th we have the Victory Day celebration, and rumor has it that General Milley may be going to Moscow to participate in the Victory Day parade. I hope that's not the case. I hope that, but if anybody remembers the Sochi Olympics and what happened after Sochi, I would certainly be on your toes after the May 9th parade, because if Putin gets what he wants and he gets Western leaders there to watch the parade, there's some danger here. And I think all eyes will be on the Black Sea and Russian naval activity and what they may try to do and further. As anybody, many of you, all you know that the Kherson controls the water supplies to the Crimea, and Crimea is drying up. So reactive, this is my point, and that's my idea, is that we often find the U.S. is reacting to events. They're not driving the events.
I want to build on what Glenn said, and then Admiral Kabanenko will speak up. When I spoke about in doing this, reviving Lend-Lease for Europe, not just for Ukraine, that was the point. It's in order for Washington to take the initiative, not just react, and to do something that is as much in the interest of NATO and the U.S. as well as in Ukraine's interest. But the fact remains that Ukraine has not done enough for all the sacrifices that it has made to persuade people to give it the support that we think it needs. And we may not like that. We may think that's a wrong policy, but that's a fact of life, and it's not going to change. And walking away from reforms, whether they're reforms in defense or so forth, is not going to help matters here, because there's already plenty of people in town, and we all know who they are, who are opposed to doing anything more for Ukraine and think that we shouldn't be supporting it. So, therefore, it is necessary for Ukraine to be innovative, reform-minded, progressive in dealing with all the problems that confront it in order to sustain a successful military effort, and that will embolden not just the United States, but Europe as well, to resist Putin. And not just in terms of military, but in terms of energy. Nord Stream 2, for example. Thank God that's been stopped, but that may come back. Information warfare and the buildup of NATO, because it's very clear from what Moscow says, and it says so openly, as far as Moscow is concerned, there's no such thing as Ukraine. It's a mental disease. It's a place on a map. That's it. They say so. Okay.
From my perspective, also, we need in Ukraine to work closely, not only to speak about maritime security and the U.S. help, the U.S. aid in this sphere, but also professionally work, first of all, to understand real threats on different levels. First of all, on political level, maritime threats from Russia. We need to prioritize our needs, what we ask aid from the U.S. to strengthen our security and defense capabilities, because as I understood now, is not a priority to strengthen our capabilities in this list of what we ask from the which support we ask from the United States. And third, from my perspective, also we absolutely agree with my colleagues what this we need in Ukraine more, let's say, leadership from the United States as a great maritime nation to with some preemptive actions to not only to help but lead our naval forces, lead our armed forces to look and see not only as some recreative possibilities and so on, but look and see as security of Ukraine at all. Because again, I would say what this should be the first priority, because we have a lot of vulnerabilities there, a lot of checky points. For example, Charkiv for Russia still continue to be a sacral place, because it is connected with the history of Russian so-called fight for Crimea. They call it Suvorov called it the Russian, very famous Russian field marshal who called these areas times of Charkov and fight for Crimea. So here in Charkov we have a vulnerability. Serpent Island is a key point for Ukraine, because right now we only have a narrow strip of international shipment to and from Odessa, Because other areas, they blocked for shipment, for commercial shipment by Russia, because Russia created the area denial zone. So we need to pay more attention on this. But nobody speak about this in our press. Nobody would like to demonstrate what he really wants to neutralize these threats in this area, because it looks like a deja vu of Azov, Sea of Azov, because it's really threat right now there. So we need to first of all clarify that on a political level and to do right things, mosquito fleet, and to prioritize our needs, our requests to help from the United States. Thank you.
Any other questions? Sir, right here. And please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm from Ukrainian. My name is Glen. I was actually interested in questioning the sort of financial security threat that is some sort of combined with military threat. Now, we all know that the Turkish pipeline was basically finished, and now there is a project, Israeli projects of the EU to finish the pipeline on the territory of Bulgaria that will go directly to Serbia. Now, there are some serious talks in Bulgaria, which is part of the Pre-Seas initiative, about actually building this pipeline by the money in Bulgaria or by the European Union investments. So there are also talks that Russia can influence this project by doing some drills near the Bulgarian coastline. Do you think that there should be something done within this framework? Should NATO address somehow this possibility, maybe start some programs of its own with the countries of the Pre-Seas initiative? Because not so long ago I was in an event when the Estonian president said that the countries of the Pre-Seas initiative are actually inviting Ukraine and other countries that want to be part of it. So can we think of a certain plan to prevent further pressure of Russia to these countries and basically to stop financial projects that also can be perceived as a part of hybrid warfare? Thank you.
Okay, I would say there's a couple of things. First of all, this is not so much a NATO problem. We can't stop the Russians from doing drills in the Black Sea. I mean, that's obvious. Even if they had not captured, all of Crimea, they could still do drills in the Black Sea, and it's perfectly legal. But it would send a signal. The real issue here is getting gas to Southeast Europe and to Ukraine until such time as Ukraine becomes self-sufficient. Now that gets back to the whole question of domestic reform, separate issue that we're not going to talk about today, but which is vital. Because without an energy reform, Ukraine remains at Russia's mercy. And you know that perhaps better than most people in the room, since you're a diplomat. What can be done? One, Ukraine has to reform its energy system in order to become self-sufficient. Two, with this $1 billion that the United States is giving to the East, to the Three Seas Initiative, plus whatever funds they can raise on their own, or that Ukraine itself can contribute to a joint project, you build infrastructure throughout Eastern Europe, connecting Ukraine and pipelines and, to East European gas terminals. 3, America is already exporting LNG to Eastern Europe. 4, Ukraine is already exporting oil to Belarus against the Russian pressure there. So we have the elements here. What we need is more gas. I would suggest to you that the possibility is there, given the objective of building a pipeline in the Eastern Mediterranean from those gas fields to Greece. Now, you're going to have to get Turkey to agree to this, and I think now that Turkey is so heavily engaged with Russia, the basis for a political settlement with regard to Turkey and the Eastern Mediterranean is there. Essentially, you build a pipeline from the Med to Turkey, in return for which Turkey gets out of Cyprus and Libya, but they get their gas. They're in the game. Pipeline goes on to Greece, and you build the interconnectors. Now, or the gas goes from Turkey through the Trans-Balkan gas pipeline back to Russia, back to Ukraine, until such time as Ukraine is able to be self-sufficient. But Ukraine, we have to hold its feet to the fire on energy reform for lots of reasons. This is one of them. But the outcome of this is that you've increased Ukraine's integration into Europe, and vice versa. You have built a stronger gas network in Europe that reduces, not eliminates, but reduces Russia's leverage and puts Russia under severe economic pressure. So it's not so much a NATO as it is an EU and American joint effort negotiations, funding, construction. I mean, we can't stop Russia from having drills, but what we can do is reduce the energy leverage through a visionary, imaginative program and that deals with the economic and political problems.
Well, thank you. I'd like to identify myself first. I'm a humble successor of Ambassador Yeltsin from the new rep to the United Nations. And my name is Sergei Slitsyn. I listened carefully to what Glen said about deterrence, and I'm not ready to make my own informed opinion about the whole notion of deterrence as a good way for Ukraine to deal with the conflict, and there are many reasons for that. So first of all, the whole theory of deterrence is very complicated. The United States went through a long history of changing the policy of deterrence. We remember the era of containment deterrence. We remember that it changed to detente deterrence. We remember the deterrence of the Reagan era. So all of those stages are quite different. We also remember how those who were behind the most powerful promoters of deterrence later on changed their opinion, including the former Secretary of State Kissinger, who, if I may, at a certain point said, and I quote, the classical notion of deterrence was that there was some consequences for which aggressors and evildoers would recoil. And then he said, in a world of suicide bombers, that calculation doesn't operate in any comparable way. Which means, in order to be effectively applying deterrence policy, you should have an opponent who is not psychotic, who is predictable, who is acting on civilized, if I may, patterns of policy or patterns of war. Putin is clearly not of the kind. Therefore, I think that when we introduce a deterrence as a policy offered to Ukraine, it's quite a very complicated issue. And as I said from the very beginning of my intervention, I'm not really eager at this particular point to come at a definite conclusion, because that should be studied and that should be referred and compared to what we really have on the ground. Thank you. That's rather a comment than a question.
You want to respond to it?
Well, I mean, again, the phrase "diplomacy without the use of force" is useless. That is Kissinger quoting Bismarck. Okay, and the point here is that the models of what you're talking about are what Joe Nye coined in the term of soft power, which was developed at the end of the Cold War when the United States was the dominant power in the world, and Russia was Russia, 1991, 93. And so the world is now more multipolar. And again, you know, when you look at how the Turks and Erdogan has negotiated with Putin, they killed 50 Turkish soldiers, but he's in Moscow. He's talking to them, but at the same time, Turkish Air Force and the drones are still killing Russians and Syrians. That's why our models of what we're trying to, because we have a whole foreign policy community in Washington that is accustomed to only one model, and that's soft power, sanctions, we got to do more of this. And I think what's, and right before us in Idlib is a complete new model that is emerging. A model of deterrence where they're using military force because Turkey has the ability and Turkey has electronic jamming equipment, which I was told yesterday the U.S. Army doesn't even have, because they're suppressing all the Russian air defenses there using their jammers that they built, and probably will eventually export to Ukraine. That's why their drones are so effective. So these types of things, you know, in this world, you can continue, as Kissinger says, keep talking, keep negotiating. But you can keep negotiating, but you can still use force. And I remember one question. I'll be quiet here. I once had a conversation. Many of you in this room may remember General Bill Odom. He was a former Deputy National Security Advisor with close friend Dr. Brzezinski here in town, and worked on the National Security Council under President Carter. One time I was in his office and with the Georgians, and they were talking about Georgia needs to get in NATO, and they were making that case, and Odom just kind of, and he's a retired 4-star U.S. general, and he said smugly, he said, well, you don't really need to be in NATO, and he says, but how do we get Russia to leave Abkhazia and South Ossetia? He said the answer is very simple. He says you kill enough Russians and eventually they'll leave. And that's a very, you know, there's a certain, if you take the Finnish model of 1939 and the ability to use force and to defend yourself, eventually you're going to make a point diplomatically. And that's all in on that note.
Walter?
I wouldn't have taken the privilege of asking a question, but I do have questions. One that's directed to Dr. Blank and Glen, and then one question to Admiral Kabanenko. The first question has to do with the fact that about American interest in the Black Sea and whether we will charge in or not. Don't we at some point, I think we raised this at the Budapest memorandum conference up at Harvard in December, aren't we a bit worried that Crimea is now not only becoming nuclear, but triadically nuclear? I mean, nuke subs, the ability to have nuke bombers, nuclear-tipped Iskanders. In other words, when it was Ukrainian, under the Budapest memorandum, it had to be nuclear-free. Under Russian control, it doesn't have to be nuclear-free. Isn't that a real strategic interest of the West, and especially the United States, to keep Crimea from descending into that sort of status of fully nuclear state? And then two, Danube. We talked about the Serpent's Island and so on. Danube is something that supplies many of the NATO countries along the way. And so isn't it possible that it is of strategic interest in a very big way for NATO to do a lot more in the Black Sea than they've been doing? And that's the question to you folks. And then to Admiral Kabanenko, Glen mentioned something, and Glen was actually part of it, and so were you. And that is the first attempt with those bows through the Kerch, it actually worked. The second time, the Russians learned that they could bring helicopters and aircraft into this situation. I think we were at a discussion of that. Isn't it possible that in our mosquito strategy that we also need a kind of anti-aircraft element? If not necessarily, or is it that we're staying away from it because we don't want an introduction of anything that has to do with aircraft, because the Russians really have a load of that. But is it possible that we also, within the mosquito situation, the mosquito fleet, we should, if the Russians knew that there were anti-aircraft capabilities in some of these little boats that went by, they might not have sent their helicopters and planes to attack the Ukrainian ships that way. So that's what I'm going to be asking you for, Admiral Kabanenko. Okay?
Okay. First of all, with regard to the nuclear, I don't think you could put nuclear subs in the Black Sea, and as far as I know, they have not done so. What they have done is introduce nuclear-capable, and note the distinction, nuclear-capable land and air-based forces. Now, all the missiles all the short-range and intermediate missiles that are coming out of Russian factories now are being built to save money as both conventional and nuclear in capability. And they're adapting also and I just published this yesterday in my monitor, land-based missiles can be adopted for sea-based use and vice versa. We see this, for example, with Caliber, with Onyx, and now with Zircon that was just been tested. So in Crimea, you have nuclear-capable but there's no confirmation of actual nuclear weapons there. Second point you raised about the Black Sea. NATO needs to do more about the Black Sea. You know, when you talk to NATO people, for the most part, they look at the Baltic, and part of the reason is because the Baltic states have been very, very successful here and in Brussels in awakening people to their sense that the Baltic is the priority theater where there's a threat. My sense is that although there's certainly possible that the real threat is, as you say, in the Black Sea. And NATO has not been nearly as proactive or reactive even with regard to the South Europe and Black Sea as it needs to be. And the Danube is a part of the example of that with Serpent Island.
I disagree with something Steve said earlier about Lend-Lease because there's an and the way I politely respond to that is that when you start getting big ships and building a navy, that requires infrastructure, and when you get small attack boats, the infrastructure is very modest and very minimal, and also becomes big targets for Russian anti-shipping missiles. So, and it requires a huge, enormous investment. And there still is a movement within the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and General Staff for Ukraine to build a big navy, you know? And I'm sorry, Ukraine doesn't have the money and resources to build a big navy, or even a couple of frigates, because it requires infrastructure, and they're big targets for the Russian anti-shipping missiles. But again, if Crimea is a part of Ukraine, and Russia is taking its oil and gas platforms and is stealing your gas, and it's moving those gas platforms further and further off the coast of Crimea into Ukrainian territory and stealing it, then Ukraine has a right to self-defense and to be able to take the attack to the Russian gas platforms. And the Ukrainian Navy has actually been contemplating this, and this is a gray area of warfare where if something happened and Ukraine took back and stopped the Russians from doing this, this is a form of encroachment. And I'm sorry, this won't, and the Russians keep moving the gas platforms further and taking Ukrainian gas. This is not a matter for the United Nations or for diplomats. It's never going to be solved. They're going to keep moving them until you hit them. And this is where the fast attack boats, Ukrainian Naval Special Forces, this is where something, if you're really serious about Ukraine and Crimea being part of Ukraine, then at some point you're going to have to do something to defend yourself and stop this type of encroachment and creeping annexation.
Yes.
Because it is what they call a gray area of warfare. And I think that Ukraine doesn't have the resources to do this, but it's also the idea of Serpent Island. Just look at the map. You know, if Serpent Island and the gas platforms keep going further, how is Ukraine going to be able to export anything from Odessa? What, Russian ships are going to start boarding Ukrainian naval vessels? And what are you going to do? Are you going to issue a note of protest at the UN? And ask the United States to what? Send an Aegis-class destroyer that we don't have, you know, to protect Ukraine? No. I mean, you guys, this is a case where you know you have to punch the Russians back in the face. You've got to do something to protect your security. I mean, look at the Sea of Azov. I mean, it's now a Russian lake, and Ukraine still has fishing agreements, and you're still trading with the Russians and over the fishing in the Sea of Azov. Why is that? And why is Crimea still exporting titanium to Russia? You know? And that titanium is going to American Boeing, right? I mean, that's American aircraft still getting titanium from Russia? That's actually coming from Ukraine? I mean, Ukraine is not a country at war. It's a country with a very confused identity about what are its national security interests. And it's figuring it out. I'm not saying entirely critical of Ukraine, but it's starting to figure it out. Sorry, I didn't know.
For my service, it's 35 years of service from the initial position on the missile corvette up to the Chief of Staff of the Ukrainian Navy and the Chief of Operations for Armed Forces and of course First Deputy Chief of Defense. I learned what it is important always to concentrate efforts to find the center of gravity, to concentrate efforts on very importantly prioritized issues. In this regard, mosquito fleet looks like a priority vessels can fast operate in any areas of these close sea, Sea of Azov or Black Sea, can quickly achieve enemy. To use the swarm approach, to carry out swarm missions. So this is asymmetric approach. It allows to influence an enemy asymmetrically, because symmetrically, based on so-called pocket frigate as national program, it's not possible to achieve balance. But balance we can achieve based on mosquito approaches. Of course, it is not only some kind of surface boats, surface platforms, aviation, mobile anti-aircraft systems, and so on. This is important. All of those aspects are important. But first of all, we need to create capabilities to quickly respond and deter Russia. Deter to avoid Russian aggression. I would say this in response to Panelists' messages. To adequately operate against aggressor before his decision to provide aggression against us. So, which allow us to deter aggressor in defense matters and defense sphere to avoid the worst scenarios. So, speaking about tactics, you mentioned anti-aircraft capabilities of such platforms. Believe they exist, but it's tactics how to use them effectively. And of course, it is important to understand which kind of opponents' capabilities could be considered as a threat to those platforms. The limit is not the strike aviation, because those boats they are maneuverable, and it is not easy to hit them. But helicopters, yes. But in this regard, these tactics should be considered as a use of different assets from different directions, and of course, this means different tactical approaches. This is not direct. Again, I will say this means asymmetric from patrol missions, from the missions to support patrols, platforms, and so on, with special operation forces on board. So, from my perspective, it looks like an advantageable approach, and it allows us to quickly create minimum urgently needed capabilities and deter enemy against the worst scenarios in the maritime domain. Thank you very much.
Okay, that wraps up this panel. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and please, round of applause for the panelists.